Welcome to the channel. Today I'm going to tell you about the series, His Dark Materials. Watch out for spoilers. We are shown a world where magic, science, and belief in God are closely intertwined. In this world, each man has his own personal daemon, a creature in the form of an animal that is part of a person's soul. The main character, Lyra Belacqua, lives in the alternate Oxford of this world, Jordan College. She, like all the people of her world, has daemon, a part of her soul represented by an animal form. Lyra leads a secluded life surrounded by teachers and students. Along with her demon Pantalaimon, or simply Pan, and other children, she disappears from morning to night on the streets of Oxford. Lyra is racing around with her best friend Roger, disturbing everyone around her. She hides from Roger in a gloomy room. There are many coffins standing around, and there are human remains lying everywhere. Roger tries to find her and she scares him. Lyra and George ponder what their demons will become when they take permanent form after growing up. We are transported to the North Pole to Lyra's uncle Lord Asriel, who is trying to film a rare phenomenon. Having managed to get there before the storm hits, he returns to base. He looks at the picture he took and is clearly pleased with the result. Now he has something to show Oxford scientists. Lyra is listening to her teacher lecture in class, and in the window she sees her arriving uncle Asriel. She tricks the teacher and makes her escape. After running across the rooftops, Lyra reaches the common room where the meeting will be held. Outside the window, she sees that the professor has poisoned the wine prepared for Asriel. She does not understand, for the master has always been kind and thoughtful of her. Finally, Asriel himself comes into the common room. The professor insists on opening the poisoned wine for Asriel, but Asriel obviously does not want to be distracted. Left alone, Asriel still pours himself some wine, at which point Lyra climbs in through the window and knocks the glass from her uncle's hands. Asriel violently grabs Lyra and she tells him that the wine was poisoned. Asriel offers to spy on Lyra for the master, especially when it comes to a certain dust. Finally, Asriel speaks to the college professors and tells them about a certain dust phenomenon and that there is a mysterious celestial city somewhere. We are then taken to another inhabitant of this world, the Gypsies. The ceremony of the boy and his demon growing up takes place. All around, everyone is rejoicing and having fun. Meanwhile, the boy goes home and sees a scary demon, and the next moment some man grabs him. Next, we are taken back to Asriel. Remembering the girl, he pulls her out of the vent and takes her into the bedroom. As he removes her shoes, he looks thoughtfully around her room. Lyra wakes up and asks her uncle about everything, but he does not give her an answer, only wishes her good night. In the morning, Roger comes to Lyra with breakfast, and he tells her that a gypsy boy, Billy Costa, has recently disappeared. He also tells her that Lyra's uncle Asriel is flying away. Lyra runs to the departing airship in a hurry. Lyra asks her uncle to take her with her to the north, but he says the north is no place for a child. Lyra cries as she watches the blimp fly away. We are taken back to the gypsies who are organizing the search for the missing boy. They suggest that the child may have been kidnapped by so-called priests. Lyra talks to Roger and says that she will get to the North Pole on her own. We are then taken to the Magisterium where the two men talk about Asriel finding the celestial city and how this is unacceptable. A woman named Mrs. Coulter arrives at the college. She meets Lyra and tells her that she knows her uncle Asriel. Mrs. Coulter suggests that Lyra go with her to London and become her assistant. Lyra asks to take her friend Roger with her as well, to which Mrs. Coulter gives her approval. The next day, Lyra talks to the master about going away with Mrs. Coulter. The master gives her an unusual device called an alethiometer that tells the truth. He asks that the device be kept secret. Lyra searches everywhere for Roger to go with him, but can't find him anywhere. The head of Gypsy talks to the mother of the missing boy, Billy Costa, and says that he is going to go to London to find the priests and take the missing children from them. Lyra meets Mrs. Coulter and tells her that she can't find Roger anywhere. She says he may have been kidnapped by the priests, as well as the other children. Mrs. Coulter promises to find Roger. At the last moment, Lyra manages to catch the airship and flies to London with Mrs. Coulter. This is how the first episode ends. The series begins with Lyra and Mrs. Coulter arriving in London. They are taken to the luxurious apartment in which Mrs. Coulter lives. She shows Lyra the apartment in her private room, but in the meantime Roger is brought to the other children who have been stolen by the priests. In their pajamas, Lyra and Mrs. Coulter have breakfast and then go to the Arctic Institute. Lyra is very fascinated by the exhibits at the Institute. Already in the evening, Mrs. Coulter and Lyra chat in the bathroom. Lyra makes up a story about Roger and Mrs. Coulter changes her face and asks Lyra never to lie to her again. At night, Lyra heard something in the vent, but didn't give it much thought. Meanwhile, the gypsies found the place where their children had been kidnapped. They realized they were too late and the children were no longer there. In the evening, guests come to Mrs. Coulter's apartment and she has prepared a dress for the liar. The same man from the magisterium comes to the college and asks to see the head that Azrael brought. The magister says that the head is in the crypt and he will not allow it to be shown. Lyra and Mrs. Coulter are busy with books, but Lyra is not good with knowledge and dreams of traveling. Then Lyra asks about the dust, and Mrs. Coulter is very interested in how Lyra knows about it. Those who have been searching for the missing children come to the mother of the missing Billy Costa and give her his sweater, confirming that the children were stolen by the priests. At night, Lyra hears the noise in the vent again and this time she goes to check what is going on. She opens the forbidden door and sees Mrs. Coulter's daemon there. Lyra doesn't understand why Mrs. Coulter's daemon is so far away from her, since demons can't be far away from their masters, but Mrs. Coulter says that Lyra is wrong. Lyra wants to find out who Mrs. Coulter is. The man from the magisterium sneaks out to find the skull. Finding it, he realizes that Azrael lied and this is not the person whose head was. Also at night he goes to a mysterious place where there is some kind of portal. And he walks out into the world we're used to, where modern cars drive. It becomes clear that this is our world. Lyra lies on the bed and examines the altiometer, wondering what the symbols are on it. Then a man from the mortuary comes in who wants to talk to Mrs. Coulter alone. They talk about Mrs. Coulter's project and the risks it poses. Lyra went over to the office to overhear the conversation, but she didn't notice the second man who came in from the magisterium. Mrs. Coulter heard Lyra and asked her to leave immediately. Mrs. Coulter escorts the guests out and goes to Lyra. Lyra realizes that she is very angry. Mrs. Coulter's daemon grabs Lyra's daemon and begins to hurt her. Lyra feels the same way her daemon does. Mrs. Coulter says that if Lyra does something like this, she will be in big trouble. Mrs. Coulter then blurts out that Azrael is actually Lyra's father. Lyra realizes that she has been lied to all along. We are transported back to the man from the magisterium who has come to our world. He meets a man in a cafe. The man from the magisterium asks to find a man who has explored the multiverse. It becomes clear that the relationship between Mrs. Coulter and Lyra has soured. Mrs. Coulter goes out on business and Lyra decides to go into her office to find out some information. The door turns out to be closed, but Lyra sneaks in through the vent. Meanwhile, Mrs. Coulter arrives at the missing children. It becomes clear that she is the one who kidnapped them. She asks the children to write letters to their loved ones. There turns out to be Roger, who writes a letter to her best friend Lyra. Meanwhile, Lyra sneaks into the study and finds documents. In them, she finds a drawing of some strange machine. Leaving, Mrs. Coulter burns all the letters the children have written. Lyra hears that the elevator is on its way up and hurries to leave the office. At the last moment, she sits down at her books and Mrs. Coulter suspects nothing. Lyra's night she talks with Pan discussing the blueprint for the device that separates Damon from the man. Guests gather at Mrs. Coulter's apartment and Lyra serves drinks to everyone. One girl starts a conversation with her and tells her that all who are in the apartment are members of the priest organization, and the priest is an abbreviation of the Sacrificial Recruiting Center, which kidnaps children for an experiment. Lyra also learns that Mrs. Coulter is in charge of this project. That woman turns out to be a journalist and Mrs. Coulter asks to be escorted out of the apartment. A large number of people give Lyra a chance to escape through the window. Mrs. Coulter starts looking for Lyra and realizes that she has escaped, and the journalist is put in a car and killed by a magisterium man. The kidnapped children are taken somewhere, saying that they are going on a journey. It's nighttime and Lyra is sitting there not knowing where to go. Then she sees Damon, who happens to be where the children were kidnapped, and Lyra is also kidnapped by a man. This concludes the second episode of His Dark Materials. Dear friends, thanks for watching. I recommend you to read this interesting sci-fi series. See you soon.